The sun in Texas doesn't just shine, it burns. By mid-July 1944, the heat rolled across the fields outside Hearne like a living thing. Dust hung in the air, clinging to boots, uniforms, and the barbed wire fence that sliced through the flat horizon. Beyond it, rows of wooden barracks shimmered in the haze. Camp Hearne, one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in the United States. That morning, the prisoners were restless. Young men, most of them barely 20, once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht, now stood in line with tin trays in hand. They expected gruel, maybe beans, maybe bread, the ration monotony of captivity. What they didn't expect was the smell. It drifted from the kitchen like a memory from another world, the thick, smoky scent of beef searing on hot iron. A few of them sniffed the air, confused. One muttered, "Fleisch?" Another laughed. "Impossible. Americans feed us like cows, not kings." Inside the mess tent, the American cook, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Joe McGinney from Kansas City, was whistling while he worked. He was flipping something round and sizzling onto soft white buns, humming a swing tune under his breath. To him, it was just lunch. To the watching Germans, it looked like witchcraft. When the first group reached the counter, they hesitated. The smell was maddening, the sight stranger still. Meat, onions, a slice of tomato, all held together by bread. One prisoner frowned. "What is this?" he asked in broken English. Joe grinned. "Meat between bread," he said. "We call it a hamburger." The German stared, suspicious. "Das ist kein Essen," he muttered. "Das ist ein Spielzeug." The others laughed. Even the guards cracked smiles. Joe shrugged, sliding the plate forward. "Try it." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of them, a boy with straw-colored hair and a sunburned face, picked it up. He studied it like it might explode. Then, with a slow motion, he took a bite. Silence fell. The men around him froze, watching. The prisoner chewed once, twice, swallowed. His expression shifted, confusion, disbelief, then something close to relief. "Warm," he said quietly. "Sweet. Real." The line moved again. Soon, they were eating, first cautiously, then hungrily, some closing their eyes as if the taste brought back something they'd forgotten. The air filled with sounds not of war, but of chewing, laughing, sighing. An American guard leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Hell," he said softly. "They look like us when Ma cooked on Sundays." Outside, the Texas wind rattled the barbed wire, but for the first time, it didn't sound like a cage. Later, one of the prisoners would write home, carefully, through the censor's approval, describing a strange meal made of bread and beef, soft and warm like nothing in Germany. His mother, in bombed-out Hamburg, would never receive the letter. But the words survived, archived years later by a historian who couldn't quite believe their simplicity. In a world burning from hatred, a sandwich had become a small act of rebellion, not against orders, but against everything the war had taught them about enemies. That evening, when the sun sank red behind the pines, the camp looked different. The guards still patrolled, the fences still glinted, the watchtowers still stood. Yet something invisible had shifted. The prisoners were quieter, thoughtful. Some hummed an American tune they'd picked up from the kitchen radio. And Joe, wiping the grease from his hands, looked at the leftover buns and shook his head. "Ain't that something?" he murmured. "Feed a man right, and he stops looking like a soldier." That night, in the barracks, the young German who had first taken the bite whispered to his bunkmate, "They think they've captured us. But maybe they've freed us." His friend chuckled softly in the dark. "Freed? In a prison?" He didn't answer. Outside, the cicadas screamed, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled. No one could have known that a moment of laughter over food would become the beginning of something far larger, an unseen battle not fought with rifles, but with empathy, curiosity, and hunger for something more human. They thought America would conquer them with power, but it began, quietly, disarmingly, with bread and meat. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Barbed wire, guards, and laughter. For the first time, laughter. A week after the strange lunch, the rhythms of Camp Hearne settled into something that felt almost like a town. Reveille at dawn. Roll call in the dust. Work details filing out through the east gate to pick cotton on Brazos bottomland. Then back by noon, sunburned and quiet. Between the barracks, a soccer pitch chalked on hard earth, a makeshift theater stage, a notice board handwritten in tidy Gothic script, choir practice Tuesdays, English class with Corporal Jenkins Thursdays, chess tournament in Baroque 14. Locals called it the Fritz Ritz, half a joke, half a grudge. Compared to Europe, it was clean, orderly, absurdly alive. There was a library stacked with donated paperbacks and a stack of German magazines 2 months out of date. There were men who had been engineers, bakers, students, who now learned the names of Texas birds and the taste of American coffee. Thinner than they liked, but hot. On Sundays, the GIs sometimes faced them in soccer. The first time the Germans won 3-0, an American sergeant laughed. "We'll see you on a baseball diamond, then." One prisoner, Hans Lemke, 22, a music student from Bremen with pianist's fingers, wrote in careful script on a Red Cross form. "They treat us like humans. I do not know whether to be grateful or ashamed." He folded the page and handed it to the censor with eyes that asked for permission life rarely gave. The guards watched the change with a discomfort they didn't have words for. Sergeant Tom Blake, Nebraska farm boy turned MP, wrote in his pocket diary, "They salute us in the morning out of habit. We answer out of decency. Feels like we're teaching each other manners." He never read it aloud. Some feelings weren't for the mess tent. In the late afternoons, a girl on a bicycle began to appear along County Road 485, blue kerchief, basket wired to the handlebars. 17, maybe. Mary Harper, from a farm south of town. She'd slow near the fence line where the guards could see her and pass an apple through the wire to whichever prisoner was unlucky enough to be posted there with a broom. The first time, the men stared like she'd tossed a grenade. The second time, one of them, broad-shouldered, straw hair, the same who had dared the first bite of hamburger, handed something back, a cartoon on brown paper, a bun with legs racing across a plate, captioned in uncertain English, "Peace sandwich." The guards pretended not to notice. Rules said no gifts, no conversation. Reality said a girl with a bicycle and a basket of apples did not threaten the Republic. Food became a language. In the kitchen, Joe McGinney learned to pronounce Kartoffelsalat, and the prisoners learned to say sir without flinching. The Germans mocked ketchup like a new religion. "Tomato sugar on meat?" one asked, scandalized. "Americans are mad," Joe answered with a squeeze bottle shaped like a tomato. Laughter stuck to the rafters like grease smoke. At night, after lights out, the camp made a sound that wasn't war. A low hum of voices rose from the barracks, men singing Lily Marlene, quietly enough to avoid the corporal's knock. From the guard shack, a phonograph answered with, "You are my sunshine." And for a verse, the melodies braided like wire that refused to cut skin. Not everything softened. Inside the fence, the old loyalties policed the new warmth. A few of the senior POWs, the true believers, posted handwritten notices about discipline, about not fraternizing with the enemy's culture. There was muttering after the soccer games, a list no one admitted existed. Hans kept his head down when he walked past them, hands in his pockets, eyes on the red dust. Survival had a posture. Still, the small decencies multiplied, stubborn as weeds. A guard lent a harmonica. A prisoner fixed a broken hinge on the chapel door. On the day of a Texas thunderstorm, GIs and Germans crowded together under the lean-to behind the mess, sharing cigarettes and the kind of silence that made sense only if you'd been wet and far from home before. Mary kept coming. Sometimes she brought a folded clipping from the Hearn Democrat, a photograph of the high school band, a notice about a church supper, as if to say, "This is what ordinary looks like." Once she pressed her palm to the wire, not quite touching the hand on the other side. "Don't cut yourself," the guard called, not unkindly, and she pulled back with a nod. The camp's bulletin listed a harvest dance for the American staff, guests not permitted. The Germans pretended not to care. In Baroque 7, Hans tuned a borrowed guitar and wrote a melody that sounded like Rain on Tin. He taught the chorus to his bunkmates. They sang it to drown out the sound of trains at night. Outside the fence, Hearn argued with itself. At the diner, a man in overalls said, "We got boys not back yet, and we're flipping steaks for Huns." The waitress refilled his coffee and said, "Maybe we're flipping them for us." She had a brother in Italy. She had her own arithmetic for kindness. In late October, a notice went up in the mess. Thanksgiving observance, November. Menu to be announced. The phrase rolled through the barracks like a rumor. No one knew what it meant except that it sounded like a holiday and smelled like a kitchen. Joe kept his head down and ordered extra flour through channels that pretended not to see him. That same week, new orders came from headquarters. Tighter discipline, no unnecessary contact, no favors. The camp commander read them in a flat voice, then closed the folder and stared out the window at men playing soccer with a ball patched in 3 colors. Unnecessary, he murmured. He had seen necessary, and it hadn't looked like laughter. The fence held. Metal does what it's built to do, but something else began to give. The image each side carried of the other, inherited from posters and speeches, started to crack like dried paint. You could hear it in small confessions, a guard admitting he liked the German bread, a prisoner murmuring English words to himself in the yard, not for show, but because they felt useful in the mouth. That night, as the generators coughed and the cicadas took over, Hans finished a letter and left a line at the bottom he almost crossed out. I think the enemy is not as I was told. I think he is tired and wants to go home, too. He folded the page very carefully, as if the fold itself could protect the thought. Beyond the wire, the bicycle bell sounded once, then again, bright as a coin. Mary coasted to a stop with a paper bag tied to her basket. She looked toward the mess, where light and smoke rose together. Joe stood at the back door, sleeves rolled, counting something that wasn't rations. Big plans, Sarge, a corporal asked. Joe grinned without looking up. Just supper, he said. The kind that travels across a table. No one in that moment could see the argument waiting under the warmth. The orders, the pushback, the men who would say no jokes with the enemy, the others who would say let them taste what freedom tastes like. The camp was quiet, expectant, like the second before rain. And a few weeks from now, heat and smoke would roll out of that kitchen again. Not just lunch this time, but a small, stubborn experiment. A plate passed through a line. A decision disguised as food. Whatever the fence was built to stop, it wasn't that. They called it a peace sandwich. And for one night, it worked. By late November, the camp smelled of wood smoke and roasting onions. Thanksgiving wasn't a German word, but the prisoners had heard the talk. A feast, a day of thanks, a kind of truce. In the mess tent, Joe McGinney had his sleeves rolled up and a stubborn idea in his head. Burgers for everyone, he said. The supply sergeant blinked. For them too? Joe nodded. Yeah, if we can feed men in France, we can feed him in Texas. Preparations started at dawn. The kitchen roared, sizzling meat, bread warming under canvas, GIs moving like clockwork. Outside, the air held that uneasy quiet before something big. Guards checked rifles twice. The camp commander, Major Duncan, read the order from headquarters. No fraternization, no shared events. He sighed, folded the paper, and said, hell, let's just call it an inspection day. By noon, the Germans had gathered near the wire, curious. They smelled it before they saw it, that same sweet smoke from months before. Rumors spread through the barracks. The cook is feeding everyone. Some laughed, others didn't believe it. An American trick, muttered one sergeant. They'll make us eat dog food and call it freedom. Then the gates opened. Tables were dragged into the open yard, rough planks on oil drums. Joe stood behind the grill, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. Line up, he said. No politics today, just lunch. The first in line was the tall one, the same boy who had bitten into that first hamburger in July. He looked at Joe with a flicker of recognition. Joe handed him a plate. Don't burn your fingers, he said. The boy nodded once, wordless. Steam curled upward as the prisoners took their first bites. Then came the laughter, low at first, cautious, then rolling across the yard like wine through the pines. Someone shouted in German, "Zu heiß," and blew on his burger, grinning. Joe laughed back. That's freedom. Burns a little going down. For a moment, the world felt off its axis. A guard passed a paper cup of lemonade to a prisoner. Someone strummed a guitar. A breeze carried the smell of grilling beef past the fence, into the fields, where even the locals on horseback paused to look. Major Duncan stood with his hands behind his back, watching. Never thought I'd see this, he said. The chaplain beside him smiled. That's because it's not war anymore, sir. It's people. But not everyone approved. Near the barracks, a small group of German officers stood apart, arms folded. One of them, Lieutenant Weber, turned to his men. They're softening you, he said quietly. Don't forget who you are. A younger soldier, eyes on his burger, replied without looking up. "Maybe I'm just hungry, sir." At dusk, when the last plate was empty and the grill had gone cold, Joe lit a cigarette and leaned against the mess wall. He watched the prisoners linger, some humming an American tune, others just staring at the horizon. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a farm after harvest. Hans Lemke brought out his guitar. His fingers, thin and elegant, picked out a slow melody. The guards listened. The Germans joined in. Even the wind seemed to hush. Someone translated the lyrics later, "Where the fence ends, the road home begins." When the music faded, there was no applause, only the crackle of the dying fire and the distant call of an owl. Joe turned to the chaplain. "Guess we did it," he said. The chaplain shook his head. "You did more than that, son. You gave them a story they'll tell when this war's dust." That night, the guards walked their rounds under a full moon. From the barracks came faint voices, German, English, laughter half asleep. In his bunk, Hans wrote a few words in his notebook. "They fed us as men, not prisoners." Tonight, the fence felt like it forgot itself. But peace, even borrowed peace, has enemies. The next morning, a telegram arrived from the regional command. Unauthorized interaction between POWs and U.S. personnel. Immediate inquiry pending. Major Duncan read it twice, then looked out his window toward the yard where yesterday's tables still stood, splattered with grease and crumbs. Joe was already there, sweeping. "Sir," he asked, "you want me to take them down?" The major thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, leave them. Let headquarters see what the hell we did wrong." As the broom scraped over the ground, the morning wind caught the smell of yesterday's feast. It carried over the fence, into the barracks, into the pine trees, and farther still, a scent that meant something neither side could name. What started as lunch had turned into something dangerous, understanding. And somewhere in Berlin, in a bunker full of smoke and lies, a different kind of officer would soon hear about it and decide that this small patch of Texas dirt needed to be reminded who was still at war. They started trading more than apples. Now it was words, folded small enough to pass through wire. Winter came softly to Texas that year. Cold mornings, smoke curling from chimneys, frost silvering the grass around the guard towers. The war felt distant and near all at once. In Barack 7, Hans Lemke sat on his bunk, a letter trembling in his hands. His mother's handwriting was shaky. "Berlin is ruins. The shop is gone. I am safe, but the city isn't." After that, Hans stopped showing up for roll call. He just stared through the cracks in the wall, where sunlight broke into thin strips across the floor. Mary Harper, the girl with the bicycle, heard through town gossip that the quiet pianist wasn't well. Against her father's warnings, she rode back to the fence. The guard, Pete, saw her coming inside. "Quick," he said, pretending to check the wire. She passed him a folded note, no bigger than a coin. Pete slid it through the diamond mesh toward Hans, who hesitated before taking it. "You'll go home one day. Don't hate the world before you see it again." Hans read it 3 times. That night, he drew a small treble clef on wrapping paper and pushed it back through the fence, his only language for thank you. The camp had changed since summer. The prisoners now brewed coffee the way Americans did, thick and sweet. Some played baseball, learning the strange geometry of the game. "You run in a square?" a German asked. "It's a diamond," Corporal Jenkins said, grinning. By week's end, they were arguing about strikes like old friends. In the evenings, Hans tuned a borrowed guitar. His fingers found a new rhythm, not marches, but jazz. The choir practiced Lily Marlene, and then slipped into Stardust. From the guard tower, a GI joined in with a harmonica. Music had learned to cross the fence long before permission did. Lieutenant Tom Brooks, the guard commander, wrote in his notebook, "They aren't the faces from the training films. They're boys who miss home." He closed the book and locked it in his footlocker. Truths like that didn't fit in official reports. Still, not everyone liked what was happening. The older German officers hung signs on the barracks. No fraternization. No English. Someone crossed it out and scribbled underneath, "Learn it anyway." The new friendships worried the camp's higher-ups, but the line between enemy and guest was fading fast. Mary's notes kept coming. A church program, a pie recipe, a photograph of her school band with an arrow. That's me. Hans kept them hidden in a tin box under his blanket. On quiet nights, he'd take them out, and unfold each one, careful not to tear the paper, as if holding on to a fragile kind of hope. The mail from Germany was harder. Letters spoke of hunger, bombed streets, missing brothers. A barber from Bremen read his and sat in silence for 10 minutes before folding it away. "Home is just another camp," he said softly. One rainy afternoon, the lights went out across the compound. In the dark, someone began to tap on a canteen, steady, like a heartbeat. Hans joined in with a few notes on the guitar. Voices rose, humming. The guards didn't stop them. For 5 minutes, there were no sides, no uniforms, only sound. Brooks wrote again, "The fence isn't what keeps them here. It's what reminds them they still matter." Then he tore the page out, unsure why he'd written it. By February, news drifted through the camp like fog. The Allies were closing in, the war nearly done. Still, the men carried on, working, singing, waiting for something they couldn't yet name. Mary's last message came on thin yellow paper. "This too will pass." Hans read it by lamplight, then folded it into the tin with the others. A few weeks later, the newspapers arrived, grainy photos, black headlines, names that made the guards go quiet: Dachau, Buchenwald, Liberation. Joe McGinney, the cook, set one of the papers face down on the counter and didn't speak for a long time. By the next morning, the laughter had vanished from the yard. The baseball diamond stood empty, the coffee untouched. Even the air felt different, heavier, older, as if the world had remembered what the war really was. The fence hadn't moved, but it felt higher again, and no one, not even Hans, could find the right words to pass through it anymore. When the photos from Dachau arrived, the laughter stopped. They came folded inside the stars and stripes, wired over teleprinter, smeared with rain from the truck that brought them. Black and white rectangles laid on a mess hall table like wounds. Barbed wire, skeletal faces, piles that should have been names. Joe McGinney didn't say anything at first. He just set the top paper down and stepped back as if the pictures carried heat. A group of prisoners drifted in, drawn by routine more than curiosity. Lieutenant Weber saw the headline, stiffened, and reached for the old answer. "Propaganda," he said in English, the word rehearsed and brittle. Joe snapped, louder than he meant to. "You still think that?" The room tightened. Forks hovered. Boots scraped. No one touched the food. The guards gathered without being called. Lieutenant Tom Brooks pressed his palm flat on the table, then lifted it, leaving a clean square in the thin film of grease. "Look," he said, voice low. "Just look." One young POW did, flinched, and looked again, as if repetition could adjust the angle of horror. "Neen," he whispered. "Nicked Moglich." Another swallowed hard and said nothing at all. Word moved through Camp Hearn like weather. Barracks emptied into the yard. Someone read the captions aloud in a voice that cracked. "Liberation, crematoria, thousands." The crowd formed and reformed. Guards, POWs, the space between them suddenly thick with something that wasn't just air. A man from Bremen spat in the dust and whispered a prayer. Another stared at the sky, hands in pockets, as if pockets could keep a world from breaking. Then came the shouts. An American corporal barked, "You knew," at no one and everyone. A prisoner answered, not denial, just anger with nowhere to go. The room lurched toward a fight, and then away from it twice. Brooks caught the corporal by the collar and pulled him back. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." Across the room, Weber grabbed a fellow POW's sleeve too tightly and hissed, "Stand straight." The sleeve-tugged man yanked away. "For what?" he asked. The question weighted like a stone. In the yard, Mary Harper's bicycle bell rang once and died. She had come with a paper bag of apples and a face that understood too late. Pete waved her off gently from the fence. "Not today." She nodded, turned back toward town, and pedaled like someone leaving a room out of respect. Hans stood at the edge of the mess hall crowd, a paper clenched so hard it creased like bark. He stared until the images blurred and then sharpened again, refusing to be merciful. His hands shook. He thought of his mother's letter, a shop shattered, a city without glass, and understood that broken things could mean different sizes of breaking. "If this is true," he said aloud, to no one in particular, "I don't know who I was fighting for." No one answered. A sentence like that widens a circle and empties it at the same time. That night the camp was loud where it had been quiet, and quiet where it had been loud. The baseball diamond went unused. The choir did not meet. In Barack 7, the tin box under Hans's blanket felt heavier than paper should. He lifted out Mary's last note. "This too will pass," and set it next to the photograph he could not unsee. The two pieces of paper did not argue. They just sat together, indecent and true. Weber and the senior men posted a notice. "All discussion of enemy lies is forbidden." Someone tore it down. Another notice went up, angrier, with 3 signatures and a threat of internal punishment. A third appeared beside it, smaller, written in clumsy English. "We are not children." In the guard shack, Joe poured coffee and didn't drink it. "I fed them," he muttered, not sure whether he was confessing or defending himself. Brooks closed his notebook without writing. "We didn't make the pictures," he said. "We just brought the paper." Morning came with a weight that bent backs. A fight broke out near the laundry. 2 POWs, one shouting "Luge, liar," the other shouting nothing, just swinging until the MPs separated them. A German chaplain asked for space in the chapel and got it. The pews filled. No one sang. At noon, Joe set out stew and bread without comment. Men filed past without jokes, without the usual shoulder bumps. A guard offered a prisoner an extra slice. The prisoner shook his head and moved on. The fence, which had learned to hold music and apples and notes folded to the size of coins, felt higher again, not because it had grown, but because everything on both sides had. That evening, Hans walked the perimeter alone, counting fence posts like rosary beads. At the north corner, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of damp cotton and wood smoke. Pete nodded from the shadow of the tower. "Long day," he said. Hans answered in English, simple and careful, "Long truth." He went back to the barracks and took out the guitar, because hands need work. The first chord buzzed. He adjusted the tuning, then started again. What came out wasn't a hymn or jazz. It was a slow, unfinished thing that sounded like a bridge being built and not yet reaching the other side. "Play something they know," someone said, exhausted. Hans shook his head. "Not tonight." The camp slept badly. In dreams, the fence leaned and did not fall. By morning, the official notices had arrived from headquarters, crisp as if the paper itself were sure. No shared events, no unnecessary contact, tightened discipline. The chaplain read the words as if they were sentences carved in a wall. Joe folded the notice and put it in his pocket with the crease perfectly aligned, the way a man behaves when he needs lines to stay straight. Hans didn't go to work detail. He went to the mess hall, found Joe scrubbing pans, and stood until the cook looked up. "I saw," Hans said. "I will do something." Joe held his gaze for a long second, searching for what that meant. "Be careful," he said finally. "These days cut." Outside, clouds stacked over the brazos like a verdict. The wind smelled of rain, of something about to break or wash clean. And when it did, the first person to step into that space between anger and shame would not be a guard or a notice or a policy. It would be Hans. The day before the war ended, the camp sounded like a church after prayer, still, hollow, waiting. May 8, 1945. Texas dawn. No bugle, no shouts, just the hiss of the grill as Joe McGinney pressed beef into perfect circles. He worked quietly, sleeves rolled, the smell of smoke rising like incense. On the counter sat a folded order, no celebrations with prisoners. Joe ignored it. "Last time," he muttered. "We do this right." Outside, the air felt heavy and strange. Guard spoke softly. Prisoners lined up for roll call, some smiling faintly, others staring at the horizon. Someone whispered "capitulate." No one corrected him. Lieutenant Tom Brooks walked into the mess and stopped. "You're out of your mind," he said, seeing the stack of buns. Joe just flipped another patty. "You can write me up later," he said. "Right now, we're feeding people." Soon the line formed, Americans and Germans, side by side, awkward but steady. The grill popped. The scent of onions drifted across the yard. Joe handed out the first plate. "No sides, no ranks," he said softly. "Just food." Hans stepped forward, took his burger, then hesitated. He looked at Joe, then at Brooks. "For memory," he said, slicing his portion in half and offering one piece to the lieutenant. Brooks paused, then accepted. They ate standing together, silent except for the wind and the faint sizzle behind them. Across the yard, laughter sparked, hesitant, fragile, real. Mary Harper appeared at the gate with a brown paper bag. Pete, the guard, waved her through with a warning glance. She placed the rolls on the table. Peace offering, she said. For a few minutes, everything felt weightless. A guard passed a plate to a prisoner. A German officer lowered his arms and joined the line. The chaplain said grace. Short, wordless, more breath than prayer. Someone played a harmonica. Hans joined in with a guitar, finding a melody without a country. When it ended, no one wanted to move. The smell of grease, wood smoke, and something new, forgiveness, maybe, hung over the camp. Joe leaned against the counter, arms crossed, sweat streaking the flour on his shirt. Brooks opened his notebook and wrote, "We won yesterday. Today, we remembered why." Then the truck came. Orders from headquarters, repatriation. Brooks read the list, voice flat. Fifth name down, Hans Lemke. He nodded once, went to his bunk, and began to pack. The tin box went in first, letters, drawings, the small treble clef. The guitar stayed behind. At the mess, Joe was cleaning pans. Hans stopped beside him. "Thank you," he said. Joe didn't look up. "You'll be fine," he muttered. "You already learned the best recipe." Hans smiled faintly. "What is it?" "Don't burn what feeds you." By the fence, Mary waited with her bicycle. She handed him a small parcel. "For the train," she said. Inside were 3 cookies and a folded card, my mother's recipe. "If you can't bake it, just remember it." Hans nodded, eyes bright but steady. "I will." He climbed onto the truck. The engine coughed, men shifting in silence. As it rolled forward, hands lifted, not salutes, not waves, just the quiet gesture of people acknowledging something fragile and unspoken. Hans looked back once, memorizing the guard tower, the mess hall, the chalk diamond where they used to play baseball. When the dust settled, the yard seemed smaller. The grill cooled. The harmonica's echo faded. The fence stood where it always had. Only now it didn't divide. It marked the memory of where division had ended. That night, Brooks sat on his bunk and wrote one last note. Peace doesn't start with treaties. It starts with food shared by enemies who stop being enemies for 10 minutes. He closed the book and turned off the lamp. By morning, Hans's bunk was empty. His name crossed off in neat blue ink. The tin box gone. Somewhere across the ocean, a young man carried a cookie recipe and the memory of a fence that had once almost disappeared. When the train crossed the Rhine, they said we were free. But freedom felt like another kind of prison. January 1946. After months in transit, Hans finally returned to Germany. The train crawled through fields of ash and frost, past cities that looked like open wounds. Bremen was a gray skeleton, bricks piled like bones, chimneys standing over silence. The air smelled of coal dust and hunger. At the station, no one cheered. A woman with red hands handed out soup that tasted of nothing. "Home," someone whispered. But the word felt wrong. Hans thought of Texas, the bright fields, the warmth of food, the laughter over hamburgers. Here, even the wind seemed to accuse. He was given a cot in a schoolroom with 30 others. By day, he carried rubble from the streets. At night, he watched candles gutter out before curfew. His mother found him days later, thinner, quieter. She hugged him once, lightly. "You're back," she said, as if testing it. He nodded, unable to say what part of him was missing. Food was scarce. One afternoon, at a church kitchen, Hans received a tin marked care, U.S.A. Inside, canned meat, white bread, a tiny chocolate bar. The smell made his throat tighten. It was the same scent as the Texas camp kitchen, grease, coffee, warmth. He thought of Joe's voice. No sides, no ranks, just food. He pocketed the chocolate like something sacred. He tried to tell neighbors that Americans had treated him with kindness, that they'd played music and shared coffee. A man spat on the ground. "We lost because of softness," he said. "Don't talk about them." After that, Hans stopped trying. He learned silence, the safest language in a country rebuilding itself from shame. At night, he wrote letters he never sent. One began, "Lieutenant Brooks, you taught me kindness. I came home to silence." He described the meal they'd shared on the last day of the war, the way the fence had felt invisible. Then he folded the page and hid it inside a psalm book. Work came and went. He swept glass from ruined churches, carried sacks of cement for British reconstruction crews, played piano at the canteen for tea and bread. The children liked his music, especially when he played American jazz. But when an older man said, "Play something German," Hans switched without a word. Even melody was a border now. One day, a British truck stopped by the river, unloading boxes stamped WRTSCHAFTSHILFE. The soldiers handed out white rolls, and someone murmured that they came from America. The smell of toasted bread followed him home. That night, he tried to make what he remembered: meat from the ration book, onions fried thin, bread too heavy to match the taste. The first bite burned his tongue. It wasn't the same. He thought often of Mary's recipe card, still folded in his wallet. If you can't bake it, just remember it. He remembered too well: the laughter, the music, the fence that forgot to divide them. But memory became dangerous currency. People traded coal and sugar, not stories. The past was a debt no one wanted to pay. In 1948, when the first American cafes opened in Bremen, Hans walked by one evening and stopped. Through the window, he saw a grill, a man pressing patties, smoke curling into light. The sign said hamburger Braten. He bought one out of curiosity, bit in, and froze. The flavor wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to bring Texas rushing back. The heat, the laughter, the simple, impossible peace of that day. He stood there, chewing slowly, eyes closed, until the vendor asked if he wanted another. Hans shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I already had one that changed everything." Walking home through the cold, he finally understood. Freedom wasn't a country or a flag. It was the ability to remember goodness and still believe in it, even when the world around you didn't. That night, he opened his old letter to Lieutenant Brooks and added one last line. "I am still trying to deserve the kindness you gave me." He didn't send it, but for the first time since the war, he slept without guilt. 1958, West Berlin. A new restaurant opens. They call it McDonald's. He heard the name first as a rumor in the U-Bahn, a place near the zoo station selling American food fast, as if hunger could be solved by speed. The city around it was a collage: cranes and scars, neon and rubble pushed neatly into corners. Coca-Cola signs winked at ration memories. Jukeboxes blasted imported confidence. Hans walked past cinemas showing cowboy films, past a kiosk where a boy practiced saying "okay" like a passport word, and followed the smell he knew by heart before he admitted it. Hamburger heaven wasn't large: chrome edges, red stools, a counter you could lean your whole day against. Teenagers in cuffed jeans laughed too loud. GIs on weekend leave traded Deutschmarks for paper-wrapped heat. Behind the glass, a man in a white cap pressed meat into circles with the practiced thumbprint of someone who understood what keeps a thing honest. Hans took a stool and read the menu, though he didn't need to. Hamburger, cheeseburger, fries. The letters looked like a telegram from another life. When his turn came, he said, "One, please," and felt absurdly formal. The kid at the register rang it up with a smile that said the future would only speak in simple sentences. The first bite stopped him. Warm, salt, a shy sweetness from the bun, onion thin as a memory. It was not Texas, but the road back ran right through it. He chewed slowly, eyes closing a moment as the grill hissed and a spatula snapped time into even measures. In the steam, he heard a harmonica. In the clang of the hood vent, he heard a fence learning how to forget itself. He opened his eyes and looked around, unsteady on the small boat of nostalgia. A wall held black and white photographs, glossy rectangles of American kitchens, parades, airfields. One image snagged him: a mess line under a canvas roof, men in khaki laughing, smoke braiding the air. At the edge of the frame, a square jaw, a forearm dark with grease, a grin that knew the science of appetite. The caption read simply, "Texas, 1944. The name below it tightened his throat: Sergeant Joseph McGinney, U.S. Army. He stood without meaning to, burger in hand, and stepped closer until his breath fogged the glass. The angle was wrong to be certain, but certainty wasn't required. The thumbprint in the bun he'd just bitten matched the one in the memory, the small dent that kept a circle honest. "Sir?" the counter boy asked, gentle. "You okay?" Hans nodded, sat back down, folded the paper wrapper like a ritual. He took out his wallet. Inside, tucked behind a ration card long expired, the recipe card Mary had given him had thinned to silk. He read the faded line: "If you can't bake it, just remember it." He realized he had done both, and neither was enough. The taste had come back to him across a continent and a decade, but the hand that first offered it was still on the far side of an ocean. He finished slowly. The last bite was the first day of peace rewritten for a city that had learned to live with checkpoints. Outside, a British patrol passed by, casual and armed. A child pressed his face to the window for the joy of looking in on light. The radio behind the counter crooned in American and then, like a man remembering his manners, slipped into German. On the way out, Hans asked the manager where the photographs came from. Franchise kit, the man said, wiping the counter. Publicity. Folks like stories with their ketchup. Hans tapped the Texas photo. Do you have his name, the cook? The manager squinted. MC something. McGinley? McGinnis? He shrugged. Old war stuff. Then, Kinder, you like the burger? Hans smiled. It tastes like starting over. He stepped into the evening, the city's cold bright on his teeth. Traffic hummed. Somewhere a saxophone leaked through a half-open club door. He found a bench and took out a postcard he carried for writing when he didn't know what to write. He printed slowly, practicing the courage of small beginnings. Dear Sergeant McGinny, do you still make them? Your food made me believe people could start over. He stopped. No address. Texas is big enough to lose hope, Indiana. He turned the card over, stared at the skyline photograph, put it back. Then he stood, walked to a public phone, and dialed the operator. United States information, please. Static, a pause, a voice that sounded like whether he trusted. City and name? Texas, he said, then laughed at himself. Maybe. Hearn. Or near it. McGinny. Joseph. He was an army cook. The line clicked, distant cards shuffling in a far room. Sir, the operator said finally, that's a lot of maybe. He thanked her anyway, hung up, and realized the search had already begun. Old school, stubborn, the way you look for a song you heard once and can hum but can't name. He walked back past the window. The photograph didn't move, but something in him did. The world had split into zones and slogans, but the grammar of a plate passed from one hand to another still made sense everywhere. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he'd write more than a postcard. He'd go to the archives, to the consulate, to the press office with the bored clerk and the good stapler. He'd find a way to cross a different kind of fence. Because some debts are paid not with money, but with proof that what fed you once can feed you again, this time as thanks. And somewhere in Texas, a man with rough hands and a careful thumbprint was either still at a grill or waiting for a letter. Hans went home through the bright cold night, carrying a taste like a map. The next morning, he would find the first address. The letter began with 2 words. Do you still make them? It arrived in the spring of 1960, postmarked West Germany. The handwriting was careful, slightly slanted. The ink faded where the pen had paused. Joe McGinny read it twice before sitting down. His diner was quiet that morning, just the hum of the refrigerator and the rattle of wind against the screen door. The coffee pot hissed like an old friend clearing its throat. The letter was from a man named Hans Lemke. The name meant nothing at first, then everything. Joe leaned back, remembering the heat of that Texas camp. The laughter that had sounded too loud for a war still burning overseas. The young prisoner who'd taken the first bite of an American hamburger and looked as though he'd discovered sunlight. The letter was short. Hans wrote, I came home to ruins. You gave me a memory of peace, and I carried it longer than I meant to. Your food made me believe people could start over. I hope you are still cooking. No return address, only Bremen. Joe folded it neatly and slipped it into his apron pocket. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the room, but his appetite had gone quiet. He stared out at the highway, long, flat, endless, and thought about how small the world could suddenly feel when one man's memory crossed it. He wrote back that night on diner stationery. Still cooking. Still remembering. You're welcome anytime. He mailed it to the only clue he had, Bremen Post Restant. A year later, a tall man in a gray coat walked into the diner. It was a Tuesday, cold rain, few customers. Joe looked up from the griddle, saw the man standing just inside the door, holding his hat like a question. Their eyes met, and the years vanished. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Joe said quietly, You found me. Hans smiled. Older now, hair threaded with silver. And you're still cooking. Joe nodded toward the counter. Sit. First one's on me. He dropped a patty on the hot plate. The sizzle filled the silence, steady and kind. Hans watched every movement. The press of the spatula, the thumbprint in the center, the quick toss of onion. Joe set the plate down between them. Still the same, Hans said softly. That's the point, Joe replied. For a few minutes, they ate without talking. The rain drummed on the roof. The jukebox played something slow, and time folded in on itself. It was 1944 again, and the world hadn't yet learned how to divide itself. Hans pulled a small packet from his coat, a photograph. It showed the camp fence, the mess tent, and a younger Joe grinning beside a charcoal grill. "I kept this," he said. "Proof that kindness can survive uniforms." Joe looked at it a long time before nodding. "We were all just trying to make it through the same day." They talked until closing, about the war, the silence after it, the strange weight of survival. When Hans stood to leave, Joe wrapped a burger in paper and handed it to him. "For the road," he said. Hans hesitated. "You think we'll ever stop being soldiers?" Joe wiped his hands on a towel. "Maybe not, but we can choose what battles we feed." Hans smiled, placed a few bills on the counter, and stepped into the rain. Joe watched him go until the taillights disappeared into the night. Weeks later, a second letter arrived, this time from Bremen again. Inside was a photograph of a small cafe window with a sign that read Der Friedensbürger, the Peace Burger. Below it, Hans had written, "For memory. For tomorrow. Thank you, my friend." Joe pinned it to the wall above the cash register. When customers asked about it, he just said, "That's history you can taste." Years passed. The photo yellowed, the diner changed owners, and the highway found new routes. But the story remained. Locals told it to travelers, the soldier and the prisoner, the meal that outlived the war. Eventually, a historian from Texas A&M tracked down the records and added their tale to a small museum exhibit in Herne. Behind glass, beside a faded recipe card and a photograph of two men sharing a meal, stands a single object, a hamburger on a porcelain plate, preserved in resin. The plaque beneath it reads, "The Taste of Peace." And the caption ends with the words Hans once wrote in his final letter. "Empires fall, flags change, but sometimes peace begins with something as small as sharing a meal."